So when I say to you $650, and that's $650 US thin and light laptop, what is the first thing that comes to your mind? And I bet you I know what you're thinking. It is something like this. A relatively heavy, relatively thick, plastic-bodied laptop that has a dim screen and probably makes a ton of sacrifices. Not only that, it has a CPU architecture that might have been launched 2, 3, or maybe even 4 years ago. But ASUS, with the Vivobook S14, they're thinking about things completely differently. It has a Lunar Lake CPU, an OLED screen, and aluminum construction. It seems like it is the dream laptop for, yes, $650. But are there any sacrifices with this thing, or is this like the ultimate laptop for 2024? So let's start right at the top with the specs. There's that latest generation Lunar Lake processor with the Ultra 5 226V, 16 gigs of memory, and a 512 gig SSD. It's exclusively available though at Best Buy, at least for now. Meanwhile, there's an upgraded version of the Vivobook S14 with the 258V and a 1TB SSD at Walmart. But that's also significantly more expensive, though it still slips in just under that $1,000 mark. One thing I need to mention is the Best Buy laptop is technically listed at $950, but we've been monitoring its price for about 6 weeks or so now, and it's been sitting at $650 for 4 of those 6 weeks. I should also mention this is our first introduction to the lowest end CPU in Intel's Lunar Lake lineup, and while it still has 8 cores and 8 threads, there's pretty significant cutbacks to clock speeds and cache. The 226V also gets a cut down Arc 130V GPU and one less neural compute engine. And speaking of connectivity, what the Vivobook S14 offers you is actually pretty impressive, especially when you compare it to a much more expensive device like, I guess, Dell's XPS lineup, or something slightly thicker like Lenovo's Slim 7i Aura Edition. There's a pair of Thunderbolt 4 ports, a full-size HDMI, a micro SD card reader, and the usual 3.5mm combo jack. But what sets the Vivobook apart is the fact that it includes 2 USB 3.2 Type A Gen 1 ports, whereas most of the competition just has one. I just wish that ASUS had put one USB-C and A on each side, because right now the layout with 2 Type A ports on the right hand side, well, it just feels a little bit odd. And either way you look at it, that layout is pretty impressive when you consider all of this is packed into a pretty thin and overall very light 14-inch chassis. So ASUS has managed to strike that fine balance between port selection and portability. Now, the problem with a lot of these thin and lights, especially the ones that cost under $1,000, is that the manufacturers, they skimp on the batteries. We're seeing 50 to 60 watt-hour units in these things. ASUS, on the other hand, with the Vivobook S14, they've gone with a 75 watt-hour unit. And when you combine that with the lowest end Lunar Lake processor, the results are, well, fantastic. We're talking about 16 hours or more, which is in a whole other dimension when compared to other Windows-based laptops we've reviewed. I mean, sure, there are times when Apple Silicon gets close, but overall, this laptop is just unbeatable right now. Actually, these numbers are simply mind-blowing when you consider that less than a year ago, we were struggling to hit over like 12 hours with Meteor Lake in some of these tests, and now 16 hours or even more is completely possible with the right setup. Even in a heavier load scenario, the only laptop that can beat this one is the MacBook Air M3, which sort of makes sense because that thing needs just 11 watts compared to the Vivobook's 30 watts. And those numbers are being put down by a laptop like this one that's rocking an OLED screen, which technically does consume a little bit more power than the LCD panels that are out there. Now, about this screen, it's one of the major pain points on a lot of more affordable laptops. But this thing is really, really good for the price. ASUS is using a 1610 1200p 60Hz OLED that's rated to cover 100% of the DCI-P3 color spectrum while running at up to 600 nits with HDR enabled. And in our tests, it just nailed color reproduction, though there is a very slight shifting into oversaturated reds. The brightness numbers, on the other hand, well, without HDR on, we got almost 400 nits, which is actually very good, since if you wanted better than this, you'd actually need a much higher end laptop. But subjectively, when you take a step back and just look at it for a couple of seconds, the colors pop. Its high contrast ratio gives every piece of content that amount of punch that everybody is looking for. This is just a great screen. I mean, I gotta give props to ASUS here. What they're doing is exactly what people want. An OLED display at under $1,000. And you know what else I have to give kudos to? That's Montech for sponsoring this video.
Montech with another insane value product, the HyperFlow ARGB AIOs, available in black or white, 240 or 360 sizes, with full platform compatibility and friendly tools along the way that not only look gorgeous with pump lighting and matching blade illumination, but also performance that should satisfy with any hot silicon thanks to high-speed fans, high-density fins on the rad, a good pump, and daisy-chained fans for easy cable management, all backed by the 6-year warranty, so you don't have to worry. Check it out below.
So at this point in time, you might be wondering, like, why should you even consider something like this, ASUS's own ZenBook lineup, when something like the Vivobook S14 seems to have everything you could possibly want and then some at a lower price point. And it's the build quality and materials I do want to sort of pause here and talk about a little bit more, because while you can feel like essence of ZenBook within the Vivobook S14, and it is a massive step up from the creaky, plasticky, fall apart in your hands feel of a lot of other very budget-minded laptops, there are a couple of little slip-ups here. Let's start with a little pet peeve of mine. This thing has the worst finish. I'm gonna emphasize that again. The worst finish I've ever come across on a laptop in the last 2 years. I'm not sure what ASUS was thinking with this so-called neutral black, but it's a frickin' mess. It shows every fingerprint, every speck of dust, you name it, it's there for everyone to see. And that's such a huge disappointment since overall build quality here is, for the most part, fantastic. The entire shell is made of aluminum alloy, the screen's hinge doesn't exhibit excess wobble, there's no flexing in the keyboard area, and in general, everything feels just well put together, except for one thing. We've had this in the lab for about a month now, and at some point during the course of normal opening and closing, the lid actually started to bow slightly upwards along the top edge. And the keyboard on this thing, I mean, anybody who's watched one of my laptop reviews probably already knows this. I'm a little bit of a laptop keyboard elitist. And I'm biased here because even the ZenBooks, ASUS's higher end devices, I don't like the keyboards all that much on those things. And this one actually takes sort of like a step back from even those. I mean, sure, ASUS advertises 1.7 millimeters of key travel, but the whole experience just feels a bit dead and lifeless, without much feedback, slightly wobbly keys, and frankly, it's a bit claustrophobic, I guess you would say. While I'm usually able to hit decent words per minute on most 14-inch laptops, I found my accuracy really struggling on this one. Then again, when compared to other sub $1,000 laptops, well, it's better than what Acer and Dell offer, that's for sure. Plus, it's got full RGB backlighting, though it's way too dim. You can actually see more light spilling out from behind the keys than coming through the letters. And while it's RGB, actually changing the color isn't all that evident at first, but ASUS is using the Windows dynamic lighting feature. Just open it up, use the drop-down next to effects, and choose whatever color you want. As for the trackpad, well, there isn't much to say other than it's a good size. It actually has better palm detection than I expected, and the buttons feature a great amount of tactile feedback. ASUS also incorporates a few additional gestures into it, like tapping in the upper right-hand corner brings up the settings, sliding your finger left and right at the top edge advances or rewinds media playback, while the left and right edges can be used to control volume and brightness. The other thing we absolutely need to talk about is the webcam and the microphone array on this thing, because it is one area that ASUS prides themselves on having a premium experience across their entire laptop lineup. Okay, so this is raw. This is the first time that I'm seeing this webcam in person, and for a sub $1,000 laptop, you couldn't ask for more. This thing actually beats a lot of the other laptops that we've had here at the office, at least visually, the way I'm looking at it right now. My skin tone looks proper, the contrast is good, there's no lens flare from the overhead lighting above me. I mean, this is very good. Now, as for the microphone array, I can't really tell you because I'm just doing this off the cuff here. I'm not listening to my own microphone array here, but you guys could be the judge of that. Now, the other thing I wanted to talk about here is the speaker setup, and they are what they are. It's a thin and light laptop, so you're gonna get thin, hollow sound without much bass. You shouldn't be expecting much from this thing, especially considering that me, and I'm sure a lot of you guys, are going to use headphones while we're on the go with an ultra portable. But you know what else isn't all that great? Well, you guessed it. Upgrade options. But with this being a thin and light laptop using Lunar Lake with its on-package memory, you probably already guessed that. Not only is the Vivobook harder to get into than like Fort Knox, but the only user upgradable item here is the PCIe Gen 4x4 M.2 SSD, which uses the standard 2280 form factor. And that leads us, believe it or not, to another surprise. The way ASUS ended up managing performance on this thing is actually really interesting. You might think that just because this is a entry-level Lunar Lake laptop, that is going to be a complete pushover when it comes to performance. Well, I've got some news for you on that one. First of all, there are 4 modes within the ASUS Control Center, and in full core workloads, 3 of those 4 are functionally identical in terms of power, temperatures, and even noise, with the only standout being whisper mode, which cuts things down in every single category. And those temperatures, well, for a thin and light laptop, they're really, really good, even with the laptop being pretty quiet overall. There's something pretty ironic here too. This Vivobook is actually running its processor at a slightly higher power level than the 258V we tested in the ZenBook S14, while also getting better temperatures too. And all of this leads into one of the hallmarks of Lunar Lake. It runs really, really cool, and that translates to low laptop skin temperatures, even in heavy workloads, since there's simply less heat to disperse. ASUS has also worked hard to ensure the few hotspots that do pop up are outside of areas that'll typically make contact with your hands or lap. So at this point in time, I'm sure a lot of you guys are wondering, this $650 laptop with Intel's entry-level Ultra 5 226V, how does this thing hold up against the competition? Let's start off in areas where these laptops will be used the most, which is general tasks like office productivity. And here, well, the Vivobook S is no faster, yet no slower than most of the other devices here. Even the much more expensive ZenBook S14 with its Ultra 7 258V. The same thing goes for single-threaded benchmarks and Cinebench. It's pretty much in line with every other thin and light we've tested in the last few months, which means for everyday computing, you'll likely won't be able to tell the difference between something like the Vivobook S14 and the ZenBooks or Slim 7i's of this world. But the second you hit this thing, or any Lunar Lake based laptop for that matter, with a heavy all-core workload, well, things tend to go just a little bit sideways. In those situations, the Vivobook heads closer to the bottom of our charts, and yet it isn't as bad as you might have thought. In a lot of cases, it actually gets almost the same performance as the ZenBook 14 OLED with the Ultra 7 155H, a laptop that you can still buy, but one that usually goes for over $1,000. It also manages to hang with the Ultra 7 258V equipped ZenBook S14 and the Yoga Slim 7i, and that's a huge problem for Intel's partners in general, since they're now selling laptops with that CPU for big money, yet it can barely distinguish itself from their entry-level models. So if a design gives that 226V just enough juice, it'll hit pretty hard, and in a laptop that costs half what many others do. I mean, look, we already knew this thing wasn't gonna set our charts on fire, but we have to frame this based on what the Vivobook S14 sets out to achieve. It's an everyday laptop that's primarily focused on providing decent performance, and yet in many situations, it competes pretty well against laptops that are double, or in some cases, 3 times its price. It also delivers some pretty impressive results whenever the ARC 130V integrated graphics or the media encode decode engine gets factored into the equation. And that's something Lunar Lake has been known for. It's got an absolutely banging GPU that's piggybacking onto an efficient CPU architecture. And that is just critical for GPU accelerated workloads in creator focused apps like Premiere and Resolve. Another benefit to Intel's approach, and of course ASUS's implementation here, is that a lot of the processor's overall performance actually remains intact when it's on battery power. I mean, sure, there's some cut downs here and there, but overall, this is one of the better devices out there when it comes to using it in more intensive tasks if you need to in a pinch while like traveling or something. Then again, nothing, and I mean nothing, comes close to the Apple M3 in these tests. And it'll last a whole lot longer too, since it's only using 11 watts, while the Vivobook S14 is using almost triple that. Of course, we also need to talk about gaming performance, starting with some synthetics in 3D Mark, and I've got to say these numbers are, well, surprisingly decent. Remember, ASUS is using the entry-level ARC 130V that has less cores and lower frequencies than the one in the ZenBook 14 or Slim 7i, and yet it manages to hang right up there with those two devices, while also trading blows with the Vivobook S14 that's using AMD's Ryzen AI 9 365. And remember, again, that device costs about $1,200 to $1,300. But then again, these are just synthetics. Let's see how that translates into real-world gaming performance. And if you're just joining us from like 2 or 3 years ago, this is going to become a complete surprise out of the blue for you, because gaming is now one of Intel's core strengths. Even in its cut down form, the ARC 130V in this Vivobook delivers really competitive numbers, mostly because ASUS is pushing almost 13 watts to it in this situation. That means it's more likely to hit peak frequencies, which in effect pushes frame rates to the point this device can pretty much embarrass last year's ZenBook S14 OLED with its 155H. And that cost almost $1,500 when it launched. It also tends to keep up pretty well with laptops that are using the higher end Ultra 7 258V. And all that points towards the Vivobook S14 being able to provide surprisingly decent gaming performance for a thin and light laptop. I mean, in many situations, you won't be able to tell the difference between it and something like the $1,500 Slim 7i Aura Edition, at least not with your naked eye. And I can't emphasize enough just how important this is for budget-focused laptop buyers that want to do some gaming on the side. This is the first device I've seen that can offer a decent gameplay experience at a really entry-level price point, since other similarly priced laptops either have much older CPUs or, like the Inspiron 14, rely on a Windows on ARM ecosystem that's truly terrible for gaming. So let's sum this up very quickly. This is a laptop when Lunar Lake launched that I was ultimately waiting for, because where every single other budget sub $1,000 thin and light makes some major sacrifices everywhere. It doesn't matter if it's the CPU, build quality, screen, or just a combination of those. The Vivobook S14 for $650, even if it was $750, it's a breath of fresh air. The market needed this, and it needed it now. Now, you might think this whole review shows in general how less expensive laptops are maybe finally getting good. Well, I'd actually challenge that. It's this particular laptop that hits way above its price category in almost every single way. Meanwhile, competing devices like the Acer Swift series, Dell Inspiron, HP OmniBook, even Samsung's Galaxy Book, and a lot more aren't anywhere near as good. They look, behave, and feel like cheap budget devices, whereas the Vivobook S14 has the DNA of something that feels a lot more premium. Now, at this point in time, you might be wondering, look, why is this Vivobook so unique? Why aren't other companies doing something like this? And I think the answer is pretty obvious. It's because the companies don't see any benefit for themselves to do this. Why incentivize customers to buy a $650 laptop when you could buy a $1,500 one that just has minor upgrades? It might just look a little bit prettier. And that's why I think this laptop right now is in that position to be the first device in a long time, the first portable device at least, to get our damn good value award. If you can find it, it provides absolutely everything someone could possibly need at an amazing, mind-blowing price point. And I think with that being said, I'm going to wrap this up. I'm Mike with Hardware Canucks, and I'm going to see you in the next one. Have a great day, guys.